Politicians here in Washington, D.C. used to say they worried a lot about federal budget deficits and the national debt. These days, not so much. But what is the national debt, and what is actually driving it? Well, first, I think we're going to need some definitions. The federal deficit is just the gap between what the government spends each year and how much it collects in tax revenue. In other words, it's the borrowing that's required to finance the spending that the amount of tax collected is insufficient to cover. Now, this deficit or borrowing adds to the total amount of government debt, which is really just the sum overall of federal deficits over time. Today, you'll hear figures that say the federal debt is $31 trillion and rising, or $93,000 per person, a quite inconceivable sum. So to put that into context, if the US ceased all borrowing tomorrow, and if every US household committed $1,000 per month to pay off that accumulated debt, it would still take 20 years for us to eliminate it. Now, we economists prefer to look at deficits and debt as a share of total gross domestic product. That's the total value of goods produced and services provided in the country during 1 year. And that's because we recognise your ability to repay debts is of course affected by how much income you're earning, in this case, how much income we're generating as a country. So what's happened to federal debt if we calculate it as a proportion of GDP over time? As you can see from this chart, it jumped massively with borrowing after the Great Recession in 2008, before continuing to creep up more slowly prior to the pandemic. Then when COVID-19 hit and that emergency pandemic spending coincided with a huge drop in tax revenues during lockdowns, we saw another huge debt spike, catapulting the debt to its highest level since World War II. Now, what's perhaps more worrying about all this is that projections for what would happen over the next 3 decades if we don't change policies shows that debt would actually continue to rise dramatically. And that's because of a growing gap between spending on the one hand and tax revenues on the other. So what's causing that longer-term problem? Well, Liberals like to blame Republicans for keeping taxes too low. But tax revenue, as you can see, is actually projected to be pretty stable over the next 3 decades. Nor is it too much defence spending that's causing this problem. In fact, defence and other day-to-day government programmes are expected to shrink as a percentage of GDP over that period. Now, the real driver of this longer-term debt problem is the rising spending associated with Social Security and Medicare benefits for a growing and ageing cohort of seniors. And that perhaps helps us explain why politicians are so reluctant to do something about it. Seniors, and those soon to be seniors, are of course more likely to vote than the rest of the population. So yes, the key message here is that crises like the financial crisis and pandemics have certainly led to big jumps in debt. But without reforms to entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, the federal debt is already on an unsustainable path. And that will require some very, very difficult decisions over the coming decades.